In the sweltering heat of August 216 BCE, 86,000 Roman soldiers marched confidently toward what they believed would be a routine victory against a smaller Carthaginian force. They had no idea they were walking straight into military history's most perfect trap, a tactical masterpiece that would echo through the corridors of time, eventually reaching the hands of a young Corsican artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte over 2 millennia later. The Battle of Cannae was not just another clash between Rome and Carthage. It was the moment when Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian general who had already terrorized Rome by crossing the Alps with elephants, would demonstrate a level of tactical genius that military academies still study today. What happened on that dusty plain in southeastern Italy would become the template for every great military mind that followed, including the Emperor of France himself. The Roman Republic, at the height of its expansion, fielded its largest army ever assembled. Under the command of consuls Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, this massive force represented the absolute pinnacle of Roman military might. Their strategy was brutally simple: use overwhelming numbers to crush Hannibal's army of 50,000 men through sheer force. It was the kind of straightforward approach that had served Rome well in countless previous campaigns. But Hannibal was no ordinary opponent. Born into a family that had sworn eternal enmity against Rome, he possessed something far more dangerous than numbers, an understanding of human psychology and battlefield dynamics that bordered on the supernatural. As the Roman legions approached, arranged in their traditional dense formation that had conquered half the Mediterranean, Hannibal was already 3 moves ahead. The Carthaginian general had spent months studying Roman tactics, learning their strengths, and more importantly, identifying their fatal weakness, their predictability. Romans fought the same way every time, head-on, with disciplined formations and relentless pressure. It was this very predictability that Hannibal intended to turn into their destruction. On the morning of August 2nd, as dust clouds announced the approach of the largest Roman army ever assembled, Hannibal arranged his forces in what appeared to be a conventional battle line. His weakest troops, Gallic and Spanish infantry, occupied the center, while his elite African heavy infantry took positions on the flanks, partially concealed from Roman view. To any Roman observer, it looked like a standard defensive formation, perhaps even a desperate one, given the obvious numerical disadvantage. What the Romans couldn't see was the trap being set. Hannibal had deliberately placed his weakest units in the center, knowing they would bend and retreat under Roman pressure. This wasn't a sign of weakness. It was the cornerstone of the most brilliant tactical deception in military history. As the Roman war horns sounded across the plains of Cannae, 86,000 soldiers began their advance with the confidence of men who had never known defeat on this scale. The ground trembled under their feet, their armor glinted in the Mediterranean sun, and their battle cries echoed across the battlefield. They were about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one who appears to be losing. Hannibal's plan required perfect timing and iron discipline from troops who were about to be asked to do something that went against every warrior's instinct: retreat, while still able to fight. The Gallic and Spanish infantry in the center, outnumbered nearly 2 to 1, watched as the Roman legions crashed into their lines like a human tsunami. The clash was thunderous. Roman swords met Celtic shields, Spanish spears thrust against Roman armor, and slowly, deliberately, Hannibal's center began to give ground. To the Romans, it appeared their superior numbers were doing exactly what they were supposed to do, overwhelming the enemy through sheer force. Consul Varro, commanding from behind the lines, watched with satisfaction as his legions pushed deeper into the Carthaginian formation. But this retreat was choreographed with the precision of a deadly dance. Hannibal had trained his men for months to execute this maneuver, falling back not in panic, but in controlled stages, always maintaining cohesion, always keeping the Romans focused on what appeared to be imminent victory. It was psychological warfare at its finest, exploiting the Roman mentality that equated forward movement with winning. As the Carthaginian center bent backward like a bow being drawn, something crucial was happening that the Romans failed to notice. Their dense formation, designed for frontal assault, was becoming increasingly compressed as they pushed forward into the narrowing space. What had begun as a broad front was becoming a crowded mass of men, packed so tightly that those in the rear could barely move, while those in the front had little room to maneuver their weapons effectively. Meanwhile, Hannibal's heavy African infantry remained motionless on the flanks, hidden partially behind the dust and chaos of battle. These were his finest troops, veterans who had fought across Spain and through the Alpine passes, disciplined soldiers who understood that patience in battle often meant the difference between victory and annihilation. The Romans, drunk on what appeared to be inevitable success, pressed forward with increasing enthusiasm. Their commanders urged them on, believing they were witnessing the collapse of Hannibal's army. In reality, they were walking deeper into a trap that had been 2,000 years in the making, not just in terms of planning, but in terms of its eventual influence on military thinking. Hannibal himself moved among his troops, not as a distant commander shouting orders from safety, but as a general who shared the risks of battle. Ancient sources describe him as being easily recognizable by his distinctive armor and his calm demeanor, even as his center appeared to crumble. He was orchestrating not just a battle, but a masterpiece of military psychology that would be studied by every great general who came after him. The moment of truth was approaching. The Roman formation had become so compressed and extended that it resembled an arrow pointed deep into Carthaginian territory, exactly what Hannibal had planned. The trap was set, the Romans were in position, and now came the most crucial phase of the operation. The dust of Cannae hung thick in the August air as nearly 90,000 men engaged in what would become the most studied battle in military history. At precisely the moment when the Roman legions believed victory was within their grasp, Hannibal gave the signal that would transform apparent defeat into legendary triumph and provide a template that would inspire generals for the next 2 millennia. With the Roman formation stretched like a spear thrust deep into his lines, Hannibal unleashed the second phase of his master plan. The African heavy infantry, who had remained motionless on the flanks while their comrades appeared to crumble in the center, suddenly wheeled inward with the precision of a closing vice. These were not the same light troops who had been giving ground. These were Hannibal's elite veterans, fresh and perfectly positioned to strike at the exposed Roman flanks. The psychology of the moment was as devastating as the tactics. Roman soldiers who had been charging forward in pursuit of what they believed were fleeing enemies suddenly found themselves attacked from the sides by fresh, disciplined troops. The confusion was instantaneous and catastrophic. Men who had been focused on pressing their advantage forward were now forced to turn and defend against attacks coming from directions they had never anticipated. But Hannibal's genius extended beyond the double envelopment. As his African infantry closed in from both sides, his Numidian cavalry, which had been engaged with Roman horsemen throughout the early phases of the battle, achieved their own decisive victory. Led by Mahabal, one of antiquity's finest cavalry commanders, the Numidians swept the Roman cavalry from the field and immediately turned their attention to the rear of the Roman infantry formation. The trap was now complete. What military historians would later term the perfect double envelopment had materialized with clockwork precision. The Romans found themselves surrounded on 3 sides, pressed from the front by the rallying Gallic and Spanish troops, crushed from both flanks by the African heavy infantry, and threatened from behind by victorious Carthaginian cavalry. The transformation from confident advance to desperate survival happened with shocking speed. Roman soldiers who had been singing victory songs minutes earlier now found themselves packed so tightly they could barely lift their weapons. The very numerical superiority that was supposed to guarantee their victory had become a liability. Too many men in too small a space, with no room to maneuver and nowhere to retreat. Ancient historians describe the horror of those final hours. Polybius, writing decades later based on eyewitness accounts, recorded how Roman soldiers in the center of the formation began to suffocate from the press of bodies, even before enemy weapons reached them. The disciplined Roman formations that had conquered the Mediterranean dissolved into panicked masses of men fighting for space to breathe, let alone fight. Hannibal's tactical brilliance lay not just in the execution of the envelopment, but in his understanding of human psychology under extreme stress. He had correctly predicted that Romans, faced with apparent success, would abandon caution and rush forward. He had anticipated that their commanders would interpret his controlled retreat as evidence of imminent victory. Most importantly, he had understood that dense formations, while powerful in frontal assault, became death traps when attacked from multiple directions. As the sun reached its zenith over the plains of Cannae, the slaughter intensified. Consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus fell fighting in the thick of battle, while Consul Gaius Terentius Varro barely escaped with a small contingent of cavalry. Of the 86,000 Romans who had marched confidently onto the battlefield that morning, fewer than 15,000 would see another sunrise. This incredible tactical masterpiece didn't end at Cannae. Its influence shaped military thinking for centuries. Hit that like button if you want to see how Napoleon himself studied and adapted these very same principles. In a candlelit tent outside Austerlitz on December 1st, 1805, Napoleon Bonaparte sat hunched over a worn copy of Polybius's Histories, his finger tracing the tactical movements that had made Cannae legendary. Around him, maps of the approaching Allied forces lay scattered, Russians and Austrians advancing with numerical superiority, confident in their ability to crush the French emperor through sheer weight of numbers. They had no idea they were about to walk into a trap refined over 2,000 years of military evolution. Napoleon had been obsessed with Hannibal since his days as a young artillery officer at the École Militaire. He had memorized every detail of the Carthaginians' campaigns, analyzed every tactical innovation, and most importantly, understood the psychological principles that made the Battle of Cannae possible. Now facing a coalition army of 85,000 men with only 68,000 of his own, he was about to demonstrate how ancient wisdom could be transformed into modern victory. The parallels were striking and intentional. Just as Hannibal had faced a numerically superior Roman force convinced of its inevitable victory, Napoleon confronted Allied commanders who believed their advantage in numbers guaranteed success. Tsar Alexander I of Russia and Emperor Francis II of Austria had positioned their forces on the Pratzen Heights, the high ground that dominated the battlefield, a position that appeared tactically sound but would prove to be their undoing. Napoleon's adaptation of Hannibal's principles began with deliberate deception. In the days leading up to battle, he had carefully cultivated an image of weakness and uncertainty. French troops were ordered to abandon the Pratzen Heights, seemingly retreating in the face of Allied pressure. Napoleon himself played the role of a nervous commander, sending envoys to negotiate and appearing to seek ways to avoid battle. It was psychological warfare worthy of the Carthaginian master. But beneath this facade of weakness lay meticulous preparation. Napoleon had studied the terrain for weeks, identifying exactly where he wanted the Allied forces to position themselves. He had calculated their likely movements, anticipated their tactical decisions, and prepared his own forces for a battle plan that would mirror Cannae's double envelopment principles while adapting them to the realities of early 19th century warfare. On the morning of December 2nd, as the famous sun of Austerlitz broke through the winter mist, the trap began to spring. The Allied forces, convinced they were facing a demoralized and retreating enemy, launched their main attack against what they believed to be Napoleon's weakened right flank. General Buxtehuden's Austrian and Russian columns descended from the heights in massive formations, confident they were delivering the decisive blow. Napoleon waited until the Allied center had been fatally weakened by the redeployment of troops to support the main attack. Then, with timing that Hannibal would have admired, he launched Marshal Soult's IV Corps directly at the now thinly defended Pratzen Heights. The psychological impact was devastating. Allied forces who believed they were winning suddenly found French troops attacking from the high ground they had just abandoned. The double envelopment that followed was Cannae reborn in the age of artillery and muskets. While Soult seized the commanding heights, Marshal Lannes and Marshal Murat struck the Allied flanks with devastating precision. The numerical superiority that was supposed to guarantee Allied victory became a liability as confused formations collided with each other in the growing chaos. The Battle of Austerlitz ended as decisively as Cannae had 2 millennia earlier. The Allied army lost 27,000 men killed, wounded or captured, while French casualties numbered fewer than 9,000. More importantly, the victory shattered the Third Coalition and established Napoleon as the master of Europe. Emperor Francis II was forced to sue for peace, while Tsar Alexander retreated to Russia with the remnants of his army. In his memoirs, dictated years later on the island of St. Helena, Napoleon explicitly acknowledged his debt to ancient military genius. "I have fought 60 battles, and I have learned nothing which I did not know at the beginning. Look at Caesar. He fought the first like the last." No, but it was Hannibal, not Caesar, who provided the template for Napoleon's greatest victories, the understanding that superior tactics and psychology could overcome numerical disadvantage, that apparent weakness could be transformed into devastating strength. The influence of Cannae extended far beyond Austerlitz. Napoleon used similar principles at Jena, Auerstedt, at Wagram, and in countless other engagements. The Carthaginians' tactical innovations, refined through 2,000 years of military thought, became the foundation of modern operational art. Staff colleges from Sandhurst to West Point still teach the principles that Hannibal first demonstrated on that dusty plain in southeastern Italy. The Battle of Cannae proved that true military genius transcends time, technology, and culture. What Hannibal achieved with bronze swords and leather shields, Napoleon recreated with muskets and artillery. The tactical principles, deception, patience, the exploitation of enemy psychology, and the perfect timing of decisive action remain as relevant today as they were in 216 BCE. If this journey through military history has inspired you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the strategies that shaped our world. Like this video if you enjoyed discovering how ancient wisdom continues to influence modern thinking, and let us know in the comments which historical connections you'd like us to explore next. The past is never truly past. It lives on in every decision, every strategy, and every moment of genius that builds upon what came before.